Welcome to the ITSS video podcast series. My name is Irene Senfter. I work on the International Order and USA team at ITSS Verona. Today we are talking with Dr. Andreas Østhagen from the Fridtjof Nansen Institute in Oslo about the prospects for security and governance in the Arctic region. The Arctic is an increasingly complex and active security environment, where traditional and non-traditional security aspects intersect and are increasingly driven by globalization and power politics. With Dr. Østhagen, we will focus on strategy, power relations, and leadership in the Arctic. Dr. Østhagen is a senior researcher at the Fridtjof Nansen Institute and an associate professor at High North Center at Nordic University Business School. He's also affiliated with the Arctic Institute, the Wilson Center, and Oslo New University College. His work focuses on geopolitics, security, ocean governance, and resource management in the Arctic and beyond. He's the author of Norway's Arctic Policy, Geopolitics, Security, and Identity from 2023, Ocean Geopolitics from 2022, and Coast Guards and Ocean Politics in the Arctic from 2020. He holds a PhD in International Relations from the University of British Columbia and is a Fulbright alumni with research visits at the Belfast Center, Harvard University, and the Wilson Polar Institute. Thank you, Dr. Østhagen, for being with us today.
Thank you very much for reading that whole long biography. Thank you.
Let's get to our first question. Since serving as a potential theater for air, land, and sea-based nuclear warfare during the Cold War, and again since the illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014, the Arctic has undergone significant changes. To give our viewers a context, in our first question, I would like to outline some of these changes in traditional and non-traditional security aspects, and talk us through the stakes, whether opposed or aligned, that China, the US, and Russia are currently holding in the Arctic region.
Yes, where to begin? Quite a broad question. The Arctic is, to start with that though, the Arctic is a region, of course, or a part of the world where you have 3 continents that meet. You have 8 states. And in fact, you could even question the use of the term region for the Arctic, right? Because here where I'm sitting in Oslo, Norway is, the Scandinavian countries are rather part of the European, Northern European region or European Arctic than really being part of, say, the Pacific Arctic or the Russian Arctic. Just to highlight that, initially when we talk about the Arctic and also talking about security in the Arctic, I think it's important to recognize that it's a massive region, it's a vast space. And similarly, if we talk, for example, about the security challenges, traditional and non-traditional, that are arising in, say, the Mediterranean, you would, if you're from the Mediterranean region, if you will, you would immediately ask which part of the Mediterranean, which issue are we talking about, which part of the Mediterranean are we talking about? And the Arctic is in many ways as complex and as diverse as the Mediterranean or the Caribbean or the South China Sea. Any of these maritime domains surrounded by states that contain resource management issues, that contain a great power politics, that have their own regional sets of dynamics, but also take place in larger international affairs. And all these things very much describe the Arctic. Right now, as we're sitting here at the start of 2024, the Arctic is increasingly important in great power competition or global politics, if you will. By that I mean the Arctic is important for a Chinese US posturing, rivalry, if you will. This notion that the US in particular, and perhaps the West in general, have, that we need to challenge China, or at least we need to compete with China on certain issues, politically, economically, even militarily, also has an impact on the Arctic. We see that, at least rhetorically we see it, perhaps not so much in actual actions on the ground. Yes, we're seeing a bit of Chinese investments in specifically the Russian part of the Arctic, We're seeing Chinese activity in the Pacific part of the Arctic, or the Bering Strait, Bering Sea region. Although where I'm sitting here in the European Arctic, we see very limited Chinese activity. So again, highlighting, right, that the Arctic suddenly is becoming relevant in this global power competition, if you will. And this is in addition to, or alongside, the tension that we have, of course, between Russia and NATO, Russia and the West, which is not something new to the Arctic. I mean, the Arctic during the Cold War was one, if not battleground, and at least an area of operations where NATO inherently wanted to control Russian activity, and Russia wanted to defend itself and possibly also be a threat to NATO from that very same space, in particularly, again, the European part of the Arctic. And of course, with tensions having increased with Russia, with the Russian atrocities in Ukraine from 2014 and especially 2022, we see again that the Arctic, and especially the Kola Peninsula, the Barents region in the wider Arctic region, is again has increased in significance when it comes to military or security concerns. And then within all this space, or with all these kind of the global posturing, the traditional military security concerns vis-a-vis Russia, we also see that the increased activity, whether it's shipping in the Arctic, whether it's cruise ship tourism, whether it's fisheries that increasingly are taking place further and further north in the Arctic, or just a focus on the effects of climate change and say the climate change adaptation. All of these issues combine into kind of non-traditional security issues, and they even overlap, right? There's, of course, some of the Russian bases that have been established along its Arctic coastline are serving, search and rescue purposes, but also serving traditional security purposes. Some of the tension that we're seeing in Arctic policies in various Arctic states, and for example, the Canadian Arctic policy, some of the tension there has been, should the Canadian government in Ottawa, should they focus more on dealing with these non-traditional security issues, which inherently are what people in the Arctic, the people who live in the Arctic, and there's quite a few, almost 4 million, depending a bit on how you count, but 2 to 4 million people living in the Arctic, should priorities go to dealing with their local needs, or should you focus on these wider security concerns that I highlighted? So, I mean, the Arctic is a fascinating part of the world, at least.
Yeah, it is fascinating. I agree. And thank you for outlining some of the factors and actors of Arctic security. Let us now look at one of those actors, the United States, and look more closely at US engagement. I know you're more focused on the northern and on Canada, if you will, but let me ask you this question. In his 1989 book, the American Arctic scholar Oran Young famously called the US approach to the Arctic region as one of benign neglect. At the recent Arctic Circle Assembly in Reykjavik, Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska has claimed that the US engagement has now leveled up due to various pieces of legislation, planned military investments, increased presence, various strategies and implementation plans, new and reactivated offices of Arctic affairs throughout US institutions, and enhanced Arctic diplomacy. What is your view on this? Is the US now walking the walk when it comes to the Arctic, or still talking the talk? And what do you think are the current strengths and weaknesses of current US Arctic policy and strategy?
I think to answer that question, I would perhaps counter with a question to you or those who are interested in that topic. That which specific issue are we talking about in the US Arctic policy? Which area are we looking at, walking or talking? I mean, you could, of course, try to generalize the US's Arctic policy and its Arctic interests. And there, perhaps I agree with Senator Murkowski in the fact that at least the US increasingly is showing a federal engagement in Arctic issues. And I think it's important to highlight, right, that, of course, if you know anything about the US political system, you know that there's 50 states, that a very small percentage of the population lives even close to the Arctic. I mean, Alaska has 700 800,000 people, and it's the only state that is anywhere close to the Arctic. So of course, the ability that this state has had to gain attention or attraction when it comes to Arctic issues has been limited, and often the focus has been on resource development, environmental concerns, and the tension between these two, and to some extent climate change issues, and how the Arctic is in many ways, in the US context, also European context, used often as a symbol for climate change. So not necessarily dealing with Arctic issues, but rather pointing to the Arctic and saying, hey, look, ice is melting, polar bears are dying, indigenous people and local populations are struggling. We need to do something with traffic situation in New York, or our climate commitments. But that has changed a bit, though, I would say. I would argue, and perhaps I'm biased. I'm an international relations scholar who looks at security, but I would argue that a lot of the U.S. attention to the Arctic has been driven by, in fact, security concerns. And especially as I talked about in the beginning of your first question, before this, this idea that China needs to be challenged in the Arctic seems in many ways also to drive a lot of Washington D.C. or federal government attention to the Arctic, suddenly realizing that, okay, so the Arctic is not only about oil and gas development versus environmental concerns. It's not only about climate change, or for that matter, Russia, but then Russia, particularly, as I highlighted before, particularly in the European context, is where Russia is the largest security threat. No, in fact, the Arctic for the US is also taking on a wider security dimension with the proximity to China, with the increased cooperation between Russia and China, that also is manifesting in military activity, military exercises, statements close to Alaska. We've seen news stories coming out of American media the last couple of years in the autumn about Chinese, Russian military naval exercises just off the coast of Alaska, disrupting Alaskan fishers, but also signaling to the US. I mean, China is signaling to the US that they're interested and willing and capable to operate at those latitudes that close to the US. And also, I mean, the proximity that actually certain US Air Force bases have to Asia, or to East Asia, basically just because of the globe and the positioning of Alaska, all kind of plays into the increased security relevance of this part of the world. So I mean, almost unfortunately, I think perhaps in an American context, I think a lot of the interest and attention to the Arctic and to Alaska does not necessarily come from specific concerns that they have in Alaska, but more how the Arctic and how Alaska also increasingly is taking place in a wider security development. And then, of course, you can look at various issues specifically in the US Arctic policy. Are they investing enough in search and rescue capacities? For example, are they investing in icebreakers sufficiently? There's been a lot of talk about the polar security cutters. It seems to be rather delayed, that whole process. But I think that follows a trend in US politics in general, with Congress being rather slow, or even at a standstill in many things. They still haven't confirmed their Arctic ambassador at large, Mike Sfraga, who's nominated by the Biden administration, but still not confirmed by Congress. So you have a lot of examples of how perhaps the lack of progress in general in US policy decision making is also hampering a bit of their Arctic focus. But I think in general now, at least, you see more attention to the issues also from Washington D.C.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are good points to think about. Yeah. We are coming to our third and last question, where we focus on the implications on governance of the developments that you have just described. So I want to ask you, most Arctic experts would agree that in the current international security environment, there's more risk of a spillover of international conflicts into the Arctic region. And Arctic security dynamics in general are more driven by great power politics. So do you think that Arctic governance, the Arctic Council or the various regional agreements, will prove resilient to these new conditions that you have described? And who do you think should take a leadership role in increasing the resilience of Arctic governance in the years ahead?
Yes, you're good on the big questions with difficult, long answers from me. But what is Arctic governance? Inherently, Arctic governance consists of what the Arctic states, the 8 of them, what the rules, regulations that they have implemented in their Arctic territories. And inherently, that makes up most of governing the Arctic is primarily done by the states themselves. And then you could look at the wider governance mechanisms that kind of covers bilaterally or multilaterally certain areas. The Arctic Council perhaps being the most famous one, but the Arctic Council is a forum that produces knowledge and recommendations, doesn't really govern per se, but it's a forum for cooperation and for, say, streamlining certain Arctic ambitions, if you will. But what really provides kind of governance beyond the territories of the Arctic states is the law of the sea. The law of the sea is the framework that inherently grants Russia the sovereign rights to resource development in its extensive maritime zones. Same with the maritime zones of Norway and Denmark via Greenland, etc., etc. And of course, you could look at other governance mechanisms. It could be the IMO for shipping, the Polar Code that was implemented or is being implemented. You could look at other specific research agreements or the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, the moratorium for fisheries in the Central Arctic Ocean, or even, for example, the continental shelf extensions that are taking place under the Law of the Sea Convention, but still with certain governance or through certain mechanisms. I mean, all of this is the complexities of Arctic governance. How is this dealing with the current tension in the Arctic, both from within interactions with Russia, but also from the larger, say, global role that the Arctic is playing? Of course, the Arctic Council is struggling a bit. Hasn't collapsed. It hasn't been suspended. The Arctic Council is still functioning, still ongoing, and even last year, resumption of cooperation with Russia on the working group level, on the project level, did happen in a way showcasing that the Arctic Council is still doing what it's supposed to do and creating knowledge and recommendations. But you don't get that Arctic Council forum or the high-level diplomatic meetings anymore, which of course is a problem in a way because it doesn't help at least to alleviate tension in the Arctic. Beyond that, the big question I think on Arctic governance is the law of the sea. Is the law of the sea being challenged in an Arctic context? Are we seeing that, for example, Russia is less interested in upholding the law of the sea? There were some comments coming from Russia only a couple of weeks ago that Russia is considering withdrawing from the Law of the Sea Convention in response to the US unilaterally extending its continental shelf per kind of regular rules and procedures, but it didn't submit claims to the commission that looks at these extension claims under the UN because the US has not ratified the Law of the Sea. It's a whole different story, but it's perhaps an example of not that the Law of the Sea Convention itself or the Arctic states' adherence to it is fracturing, but that perhaps there being questions asked about it. But I think inherently Russia is the country, not only in the Arctic, but also in a global context that has the most to gain from the Law of the Sea Convention being upheld. I mean, Russia has now on top of my head, I think Russia has the second largest or the third largest exclusive economic zone in the world. So the sovereign rights that Russia is enjoying in the Arctic to resource development, they come from the law of the sea. So I can't really see how Russia would benefit from withdrawing from this convention in general. But I think, of course, we're seeing more questions asked about Russia adhering to international law, and also what progress can be made in the Arctic region on these various kind of governance mechanisms. For example, the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement that came into place after the Russian annexation of Crimea, but before the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. How could we proceed with similar type of agreements or similar type of new small governance mechanisms when we can't really talk to Russia diplomatically anymore? That's a challenge, definitely. And then finally, to your question on who can take lead. I mean, again, maybe I'm biased, but I come from a Nordic country, right? I come from a country, Norway, that has focused a lot on the Arctic. Over 2 decades now, Norway has prioritized the Arctic. And I don't necessarily think Norway can take the lead. Various reasons for that. First and foremost, kind of our staunch kind of NATO focus or support of the NATO alliance and the challenges that we have with Russia. But I think perhaps the Nordic countries themselves as a bloc, now when Sweden and Finland and now are finally joining NATO, barring the final Hungary accepting Sweden, but now when Turkey has. But still, I think the Nordic bloc in some ways could, yes, they're all NATO members now, and that might increase tension to some extent. But at the same time, it also provides clarity and kind of drawing the lines that everyone knew already was kind of drawn already. But at least now we have more clarity to those lines, and perhaps the Nordic countries could also act in some ways as a stabilizing force. Maybe more cooperation amongst the Nordic countries can also then help them deal with more interest from the US in the Arctic context, which often is seen as a good thing, more American interest. But there's also fear of more American or even French, British, German Arctic interest not necessarily leading to reduced tension in the Arctic. So maybe the Nordic countries can in some way alleviate some of that tension and pressure, also with regards to Russia and even outside actors like China or even India or the EU for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
So that's at least a hope.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to watch this unfold over the next months and years. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Østhagen. Thank you for your insights, for your time, for being with us today. I hope maybe we'll see you again at one of our podcasts. To our viewers, thank you for watching. This is the ITSS video podcast series. Please do check in for other episodes. You can find all the information on itssverona.it. Thank you again, and see you next time.